Did you know I have access to several deadly plants in my backyard? And if I wanted to, I could poison you with them, and no one would ever suspect it was me. Mostly because, in my glorious paranoia, I would have an alibi so airtight it would go down in history as the greatest alibi ever created. Granted, the plant is only poisonous if you travel back about 300 years, because that's when people thought it was deadly. Though I don't recommend time travel. Besides creating paradox, you also have to explain modern English to people who still think bathing once a week is acceptable. Before I get even more off topic, the plant in today's video is the tomato. Though you probably guessed that already because you clicked on the title, unless you just click random history videos hoping for the best, in which case, welcome. A fruit that somehow ended up on burgers, pizzas, pasta, salads, ketchup, and occasionally launched at bad performers. I threw in the other day actually, not because they were bad, I was just bored. Today, tomatoes are everywhere. Entire cuisines depend on them. Italy is practically synonymous with tomato sauce and ketchup, but for hundreds of years, many Europeans generally believed tomatoes were poisonous, and honestly they had pretty good reasons for it, just not the one they thought. The tomato originated in western South America, regions that are now Peru and Ecuador. Wild tomatoes were tiny, about the size of a blueberry actually, which honestly makes modern tomatoes another example of humanity looking at a plant and saying, we can make that bigger. The people of Central and South America had already been cultivating tomatoes for centuries before Europeans ever saw one. The Aztecs even had a word for them, tomatel, which with only a few changes became the English word tomato. So unlike a lot of foods that traveled around the world and changed names a dozen times, this one basically introduced itself. Then came the age of exploration. Spanish explorers brought tomatoes back to Europe during the 1500s, and that's when everything got weird, because Europeans looked at this bright red fruit and immediately became suspicious. Now, to be fair, it does look like something nature would invent as a trap. The biggest problem was that tomatoes belong to the nightshade family. Now, if you've never heard of nightshade before, congratulations. You lived a much more peaceful life than medieval botanists. Some members of the nightshade family are incredibly poisonous. So when Europeans discovered this unfamiliar red fruit growing on a plant related to its poisonous species, they understandably became nervous. And don't judge. You probably would have too. Unfortunately, they also jumped to the wrong. The tomato itself wasn't the problem. Wealthy Europeans often ate from pewter plates, which back then, pewter contained a significant amount of lead, and tomatoes were naturally acidic. So when tomato juice sat on those plates, it could pull lead into the food, and people got sick, and sometimes very sick. And naturally, everyone blamed the tomato. Meanwhile, the actual culprit was the plate. Imagine getting framed by your own salad. Because poorer people usually couldn't afford fancy pewter plates, they were much less likely to suffer from lead poisoning this way, which meant the rich thought tomatoes were deadly, while the poor kept eating them. And for a long time, tomatoes were mostly grown as ornamental plants. People thought they just looked nice. They just weren't particularly interested in eating them, which honestly sounds like the most modern gardener ever. Imagine looking at a tomato and thinking, what a beautiful decoration, instead of, I should turn this into pasta sauce. Eventually, people figured out the obvious. Tomatoes weren't trying to assassinate anyone that we know of. The plates were. And once that misunderstanding disappeared, tomatoes exploded in popularity, especially in Italy. Now, here's something a lot of people don't realize. Italian food wasn't always covered in tomato sauce. There was a time when pizza had no tomatoes, pasta had no marinara, and lasagna had no red sauce. If you already watched my pizza video, which you should anyway because it's very good, not biased at all, you would know that. Honestly, this sounds less like Italy and more like an alternative universe. Which also means the same people who would start a civil war because you added too much sugar to marinara probably have ancestors who never even seen a tomato. As tomatoes spread throughout Europe, they became one of the defining ingredients of Mediterranean cooking. Then they spread almost everywhere else. Today, there are thousands of varieties. Tiny cherry tomatoes, massive beefsteak tomatoes, yellow ones, purple ones, green ones. At this point, humanity has bred tomatoes into more colors than a crayon box, though I don't think the Marines will switch to what they like eating the most. And despite all the popularity, people still can't agree on one simple question. Is the tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Scientifically, it's a fruit. It developed from the flower of the plant and contains seed. Case closed. Except in 1983, the United States Supreme Court ruled that tomatoes could legally be considered vegetables. Not because science changed, but because taxes existed. Imagine discovering a new species, only for the government to walk in and say, cool, that's taxable differently. Vegetables were taxed differently than fruits when imported. So the government basically looked at biology and said, we respectively disagree. Honestly, that does feel like a very government thing to do, and I would probably do the same because I'm a cheap asshole. Today, tomatoes are one of the most widely grown crops on earth. Hundreds of millions of tons are produced each year. They are used in sauces, soups, sandwiches, salads, salsa, juice, ketchup, and some people still argue whether pineapple belongs on pizza when tomatoes weren't even the original concept. Perspective is important. So next time you slice a tomato, remember you're holding a fruit that crushed oceans, terrified an entire continent, got blamed for poisoning rich people, accidentally changed Italian cuisine forever, and somehow lost argument against tax. Granted, I think we all have at some point. And that is the history of the tomato. A story about exploration, misunderstanding, and humanity's remarkable ability to blame the wrong thing. Now, if you excuse me, I want to make a sandwich. And yes, this came tomato on it. If that offends you, Remember, the tomato has survived worse than your shitty opinion. Thank you, and as usual, like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments what food, ingredient, or drink I have been covering next.